Imagine a world where a man's face was worth more than his name, where justice had no uniform, no courtroom, and often no mercy. In the fading light of the American frontier, bounty hunters rode between law and lawlessness, chasing human rewards across deserts, ghost towns, and unforgiving plains. Some were heroes, many were predators, and most lived in the moral shadows of a brutal era. Tonight, as the West slowly settles into silence, we'll uncover the hunted lives, dangerous deals, and quiet madness behind Wild West bounty hunters. If you enjoy drifting to sleep with dark, true history told calmly and respectfully, subscribe now and let history carry you into rest. Out on the edge of the American frontier, money did not always clink in coins or rest neatly folded in a pocket. Sometimes it walked, breathed, ran, and hid. In the Wild West, a human life could become a unit of exchange, assigned a value in ink and paper, nailed to wood and stone, and left fluttering in the wind. Bounties turned people into currency, and nowhere was this more visible than on the walls of saloons and courthouse doors, where the price of a man's capture, or death, was displayed as casually as a notice for a lost horse. A bounty poster was simple, direct, and unsettling. A name sometimes misspelled, a rough description, often vague. A reward amount written boldly at the top, larger than anything else. That number mattered more than the words beneath it. It told anyone who could read that this person, somewhere out there in the dust and distance, was worth money. Not for what they could build, grow, or contribute, but for being found, restrained, delivered, or ended. In towns where cash was scarce and survival uncertain, those numbers carried weight. $50 could mean months of food. $100 could buy land, equipment, or passage east. In an era when labor was brutal and wages unreliable, a single successful bounty could change a person's fortunes overnight. It is no wonder that people stared at those posters longer than they intended to, doing quiet math in their heads, imagining what that reward could mean for their own lives. Courthouse doors were the official face of this system. The law nailed its announcements there, signaling authority and legitimacy. A bounty posted on a courthouse suggested justice, order, and due process, even when the reality was far messier. Saloons, on the other hand, were where the system truly came alive. Posters tacked beside whiskey ads and card tables invited conversation. A man would lean back on a stool, sip his drink, and say a name out loud, testing how it sounded. Another would claim he'd seen that face weeks ago riding north. Truth and rumor blended easily in places soaked with alcohol and ambition. The value assigned to a wanted person was rarely calculated with care. It reflected fear, anger, embarrassment, or political pressure more than any rational assessment. A man who stole a horse might be worth more than one who assaulted a neighbor, simply because horses were essential to survival. Someone who humiliated a sheriff could suddenly become very expensive. The reward did not measure the harm done. It measured how badly someone wanted the problem removed. Over time, people began to speak of bounties the way they spoke of wages or prices. He's worth $20. That one's $100 if you bring him in breathing. These phrases slipped into everyday speech, flattening human complexity into simple numbers. A wanted man ceased to be a person with a past or a family. He became an amount, a figure that could be compared, chased, or ignored depending on its size. This transformation affected everyone involved, not just the hunted. For the hunters, it altered how they looked at others. Faces became inventory. Movements became opportunities. A stranger entering town might prompt curiosity, but also calculation. Does he match a description? Does he walk like someone who's been running? Is there money attached to him? In this way, bounty culture encouraged suspicion as a survival skill, slowly eroding trust in already fragile communities. Even ordinary citizens absorbed this mindset. Children grew up seeing posters with grim faces and promised rewards. They learned early that the law could put a price on a person, and that such pricing was normal. When someone disappeared or was dragged through town in chains, the conversation often turned quickly to money. Was the reward paid? Was it enough? Was it worth the trouble? Moral questions came second, if they came at all. The posters themselves were often inaccurate. Descriptions were rushed, exaggerated, or outdated. Hair color, height, scars. These details were guessed at or borrowed from memory. Yet once printed, they carried authority. Someone who vaguely resembled a wanted person might find themselves suddenly valuable, whether or not they had done anything wrong. In this way, currency blurred into chaos as the system rewarded speed and aggression over certainty. The phrase, dead or alive, made the conversion of life into currency explicit. Bringing someone in alive required effort, risk, and restraint. Bringing proof of death was faster, safer, and harder to dispute. As a result, the market quietly favored death. A body or part of one was easier to transport than a struggling prisoner. The reward amount stayed the same, but the cost to the hunter was lower. Economics, not cruelty alone, shaped these choices. Communities rarely confronted this contradiction directly. Towns needed order but lacked resources. They wanted criminals gone but did not want to pay full-time lawmen. Bounties offered a solution that shifted responsibility outward. If violence occurred, it happened somewhere else, carried out by someone else. The money changed hands, and the town moved on. Over time, repeated exposure to this system dulled emotional responses. Seeing a name crossed out on a poster no longer shocked people. It signaled completion, transaction finished. Sometimes another number was added beneath it, smaller, for someone else connected to the original crime. The wall became a ledger of human accounts, balanced not with compassion but with closure. Not all bounties were posted by governments. Railroads, banks, and private landowners issued their own rewards, competing with public notices. This privatization of justice further blurred lines. A person could be worth different amounts to different interests, depending on who felt threatened or wronged. In some cases, a single individual carried multiple prices, layered like competing bids in a market that never slept. This environment encouraged exaggeration. To justify higher rewards, crimes were described in darker terms. A thief became a menace. A troublemaker became a threat to civilization itself. Language inflated value, just as merchants inflated prices in times of scarcity. Fear became a form of currency too, traded alongside silver and gold. The hunted were aware of this system, and it shaped their behavior. Knowing there was money attached to their capture meant that strangers were dangerous. Hospitality could be a trap. A friendly offer of food might hide calculation. The awareness that one's life had been converted into a number created a constant, low-level terror, a sense of being hunted not for justice but for profit. Some tried to lower their own value by fading into anonymity. They changed names, altered appearances, avoided towns where posters were common. Others embraced notoriety, committing more visible crimes to increase their price, believing that a higher reward brought fame, leverage, or bargaining power. In this twisted logic, value became identity. The presence of bounties also reshaped the meaning of work. Hunting people was not framed as murder or kidnapping, but as labor. It was something you did to earn a living. This framing allowed ordinary people to justify extraordinary violence. They were not killing, they were collecting. Not dragging someone through the dirt, they were delivering goods. Payment disputes revealed the fragility of this arrangement. A hunter would arrive with proof, expecting the posted amount, only to be told the town had reconsidered, that funds were unavailable, or that the terms had changed. In those moments, the illusion of orderly currency shattered. A life had been risked or taken, and the promised exchange failed. Resentment festered, sometimes exploding into further violence. Yet the system persisted because it filled a vacuum. In places where institutions were weak, currency had to be flexible, and morality even more so. Bounties offered clarity in a confusing world. They told people what mattered, what was valued, and what actions were rewarded. In doing so, they quietly trained generations to think of justice in transactional terms. As the frontier slowly closed and formal law enforcement expanded, The walls grew quieter. Posters faded, tore, and fell. The prices they displayed lost relevance as courts and prisons replaced rewards and ropes. But the memory lingered. The idea that a human life could be assigned a number did not vanish. It merely moved into different forms, less visible, but no less powerful. Looking back, it is tempting to see bounty posters as relics, artifacts of a harsher, simpler time. Yet they reveal something enduring about how societies cope with fear and scarcity. When resources are limited and danger feels close, people search for systems that promise control. Turning lives into currency offers that promise, even as it corrodes the very values it claims to protect. In the soft glow of a lantern, as a saloon emptied and the wind rustled paper against wood, those posters waited. They did not chase anyone. They did not pull a trigger. They simply existed, quietly converting breath and blood into numbers, reminding everyone who passed that in this world, at this moment, survival had a price, and sometimes that price was written over a human name. On the frontier, authority was not something you wore. It was something you claimed, something others tolerated, or something you enforced with reputation and resolve. In the world of bounty hunting, there was no badge required because there was no clear gate to pass through. No academy, no oath, no uniform. One day a person was a drifter, a former soldier, an outlaw lying low, or a man simply out of options. The next day, that same person could decide to hunt another human being for money, and the law would often accept it without question. This openness was not an accident. It grew out of necessity. Towns spread faster than institutions. Settlements appeared almost overnight along rail lines, rivers, and mining claims, but sheriffs and courts lagged behind. Even when a sheriff existed, he might be responsible for hundreds of miles of territory with no deputies and little funding. In that vacuum, the idea that only certain people could enforce the law felt unrealistic. Anyone willing to take the risk was often welcomed. Bounty hunting fit neatly into this reality because it required almost nothing to begin. There were no licenses to apply for, no background checks, no proof of character. If a reward was posted, that was permission enough. The paper itself acted as a kind of temporary authority, granting power to whoever chose to act on it. The moment someone decided to pursue the reward, they stepped into a role that existed entirely outside formal structure. Former soldiers were especially common among these self-appointed hunters. Many had returned from war trained in violence, but with few civilian skills that translated into stable work. The frontier offered familiarity, weapons, danger, long distances, and a loose chain of command. Bounty hunting felt like a continuation of what they already knew, except now the enemy had a name and a price. There was no officer giving orders, only the promise of payment at the end. Drifters and migrants also found the role easy to slip into. The West was full of people in motion, men who followed work from place to place, rarely staying long enough to build roots. For them, bounty hunting required no commitment. You could take a job, follow a lead, and move on. If it went wrong, you disappeared into the next town, carrying no official record of failure behind you. Perhaps most unsettling was how easily outlaws themselves crossed into bounty hunting. A man who had once been chased could become the chaser simply by deciding to do so. Sometimes this shift was strategic. Hunting others drew attention away from past crimes or earned favor with local authorities. Sometimes it was opportunistic. An outlaw recognized the system from the inside and knew how to exploit it better than anyone else. There was no central registry of who was allowed to hunt. A sheriff might recognize a face or hear a reputation, but reputation itself was slippery. Stories traveled faster than facts, growing more dramatic with each telling. A man known as dangerous might be feared into compliance, while a man known as ruthless might be quietly encouraged, because results mattered more than methods. Because there was no badge, there was also no clear line between legal force and criminal violence. If a bounty hunter used excessive force, the question was not whether he had authority, but whether anyone cared enough to challenge him. Often towns did not. If the wanted person was gone and order seemed restored, the details were overlooked. This lack of barriers attracted people who would never have been accepted into formal law enforcement. Men with violent pasts, unstable tempers, or questionable motives found a role that not only tolerated them but rewarded them. The frontier did not ask why you wanted to hunt someone. It only asked whether you succeeded. The speed with which someone could become a bounty hunter was striking. There was no transition period, no learning phase recognized by the law. One evening, a man could study a poster in a saloon, weighing the reward against the risk. By morning, he might be riding out with a rifle, a rope, and a plan formed more by instinct than experience. Overnight, identity shifted. This sudden shift affected how people saw themselves. Taking on the role of hunter could feel empowering, especially for those who had felt invisible or powerless. The poster gave direction. The reward gave purpose. For someone adrift, that clarity could be intoxicating. The absence of formal approval made the decision feel personal, even heroic, as though one were choosing to step into history rather than being assigned a task. Yet that same absence removed restraint. With no code of conduct enforced by an institution, each hunter defined their own rules. Some tried to act carefully, believing in a rough sense of justice. Others saw only profit. Without a badge to answer to, accountability depended entirely on community reaction, which was inconsistent at best. Towns often played a double role in this dynamic. Publicly, they upheld the idea of law and order. Privately, they relied on individuals who operated far outside legal norms. This contradiction was rarely discussed openly. Instead, it was managed through silence and selective memory. If a hunter brought results, his past was forgiven. If he caused trouble, he was labeled a rogue and quietly pushed away. The lack of official status also meant that failure carried no formal consequences. If a bounty hunter made a mistake, pursued the wrong person, or caused collateral damage, there was rarely a system to discipline them. At worst, they might face personal retaliation or be refused payment. At best, the incident would fade into rumor. The absence of oversight encouraged risk-taking and recklessness. Weapons, not badges, became the true symbols of authority. A gun on the hip spoke louder than paperwork ever could. Confidence, posture, and reputation replaced uniforms and titles. In this environment, someone skilled in intimidation could project legitimacy without possessing any. The line between hunter and bully blurred easily. For communities, this arrangement was both convenient and dangerous. It outsourced enforcement to whoever was willing, reducing immediate burdens on towns that lacked resources. But it also invited instability. When anyone could claim the right to hunt, conflicts multiplied. Two hunters might pursue the same reward, turning competitors into enemies. Personal grudges could masquerade as justice, hidden behind the language of law. The idea that no badge was required also reshaped public trust. People learned that authority was fluid, not fixed. The man knocking on your door with a weapon might be acting under the law, or might simply claim to be. Ordinary citizens had to judge credibility quickly. Often under pressure, mistakes could be fatal. This uncertainty created a culture of cautious compliance. Many chose not to resist, even when unsure, because resistance carried risk. If the hunter was legitimate, resisting made you look guilty. If he was not, resisting might provoke violence. In both cases, the safest choice often felt like submission. Over time, the ease of entry into bounty hunting attracted those who were drawn less by justice and more by the freedom it offered. Freedom from oversight, freedom from fixed rules, freedom to define one's own version of right and wrong. The absence of a badge was not a flaw to them, it was the appeal. Even those with good intentions were shaped by this structure. A man might begin with a sincere belief in helping a town or earning honest money, but repeated exposure to danger, betrayal, and violence eroded restraint. Without institutional support or ethical reinforcement, decisions drifted toward whatever ensured survival and payment. The frontier myth later romanticized this openness, portraying it as rugged individualism. In reality, it was improvisation born of scarcity. The lack of badges did not represent freedom so much as absence of systems, protections, and accountability. Bounty hunting filled that absence imperfectly, often brutally. As formal law enforcement expanded, the idea that anyone could hunt anyone else began to feel intolerable. Uniforms, badges, and procedures emerged not just to establish authority, but to limit it. They drew lines that had once been dangerously blurred, but during the height of the bounty era, those lines barely existed. Looking back, the speed with which someone could become a bounty hunter overnight reveals how fragile authority was on the frontier. Power did not flow from institutions downward. It bubbled up wherever need, opportunity, and force intersected. In that world, identity was flexible, roles were temporary, and morality was negotiable. When night fell and campfires burned low, many of these hunters were just men again, tired, uncertain, carrying the weight of what they had done or were about to do. Without a badge to define them, they were left alone with their choices. The paper that gave them purpose by day offered no comfort in the dark. And in that silence, the true cost of a world with no gatekeepers quietly settled in, heavier than any reward they might collect. On the weathered paper of a bounty poster, 3 words carried a weight far heavier than the ink that formed them, alive or dead. They appeared almost casually, often beneath a name and a reward amount, as if they were a practical footnote rather than a moral line. Yet those words created a dangerous ambiguity, one that shaped choices, justified violence, and quietly pushed the frontier toward its darkest instincts. In theory, they offered flexibility. In practice, they made death the easier path. To understand why dead was often preferred, it helps to imagine the realities of capture in the Wild West. Bringing someone in alive was not a simple task. It required surprise, physical strength, restraint, and constant vigilance. A living prisoner could fight, flee, scream for help, or turn the tables at any moment. He needed food, water, and guarding. Every mile back to town was another opportunity for escape or ambush. Survival depended not only on skill but on luck. A dead body, by contrast, was final. It did not resist. It did not need watching through the night. It could not tell a different version of events. Proof of death could be as grimly simple as a corpse, a photograph, or even a severed body part. For a hunter operating alone or with limited resources, the calculation was brutally clear. The reward amount was the same, but the risk was lower. Bounty posters rarely clarified preference. The law often claimed neutrality, suggesting that justice would be served either way. But this neutrality masked a quiet incentive structure. By failing to prioritize capture over killing, the system allowed economics to make the decision. When survival and profit collided, survival usually won. This ambiguity also protected the towns and authorities who posted the bounties. If a wanted person was brought in dead, officials could shrug and point to the poster. They had not ordered an execution, they could say. They had simply offered a reward. Responsibility dissolved into phrasing. The moral burden shifted away from institutions and onto individuals already operating in moral gray zones. For bounty hunters, this phrasing offered both permission and cover. Killing could be framed as necessity rather than choice. A struggle was claimed. A threat was implied. Even when death came quickly, explanations followed easily. He reached for a gun. He tried to run. He forced my hand. In a world where witnesses were rare and sympathy for the hunted was limited, these explanations were often accepted without question. Over time, patterns emerged. Hunters known for bringing in bodies rather than prisoners developed reputations for efficiency. Towns desperate for results favored them quietly, even if publicly they spoke of justice. Other hunters learned from observation. If those who killed were paid faster and questioned less, behavior adapted. Violence became normalized, even expected. The hunted understood this reality too. Seeing alive or dead on a poster was not reassuring. It was a warning that surrender might not save them. If death carried no penalty for the hunter, why risk capture at all? This awareness made fugitives more desperate, more likely to resist, more likely to shoot first. The ambiguity fed a cycle where fear justified force, and force deepened fear. In this way, the phrase shaped encounters before they even happened. When a hunter approached a wanted person, both sides carried assumptions. The hunter assumed resistance. The hunted assumed mercy was unlikely. Tension escalated instantly. Situations that might have ended in arrest elsewhere exploded into gunfire on the frontier. There was also a practical issue of proof. Alive required certainty. You had to deliver the correct person, identify them, and hand them over. Dead proof was sometimes disturbingly flexible. In some regions, ears, fingers, or scalps were accepted as evidence. This reduced a human being to a token, a receipt in a transaction. Mistakes were inevitable, but they were rarely corrected. Once proof was accepted and payment made, the matter was considered closed. This system encouraged shortcuts. Hunters did not always verify identities carefully. Resemblance could be enough. Possession of a similar horse, weapon, or name might seal a fate. If doubts arose, killing erased them. A corpse could not protest or appeal. Ambiguity became a tool, smoothing over uncertainty with finality. Communities were complicit in this arrangement. Many did not want trials or prolonged drama. They wanted quiet. A dead outlaw could not return. He could not escape jail, threaten witnesses, or require resources. The town could move on, telling itself that order had been restored. The cost, paid elsewhere, remained abstract. The phrase also revealed how thin the line was between law enforcement and execution. In places with strong institutions, punishment followed process. On the frontier, process was often replaced by outcome. If the problem disappeared, the method mattered less. Alive or dead, collapsed the distance between arrest and death, turning both into acceptable conclusions. Some hunters wrestled with this. Letters and accounts suggest moments of hesitation, choices weighed in silence. But hesitation was dangerous. It slowed reactions. In confrontations measured in seconds, moral reflection could be fatal. Over time, even those who began with restraint learned to act decisively, meaning lethally, because the environment rewarded it. The ambiguity also allowed towns to deny their own role in violence. When deaths mounted, blame was diffuse. Hunters blamed resistance. Authorities blamed the poster's wording. Citizens blamed the criminal's choices. Responsibility scattered until no one held it fully. The phrase, alive or dead, sat at the center of this diffusion, small and powerful. As bounty hunting became more common, stories circulated of hunters who specialized in bringing targets in alive. These stories were told with admiration, but also with disbelief. Such hunters were seen as exceptional, almost unrealistic. The default expectation had shifted. Death was no longer shocking, survival was. This shift had long-term consequences. It hardened attitudes toward crime and punishment, reinforcing the idea that some lives were expendable. Once society accepts death as an equally valid outcome to capture, it becomes easier to accept it elsewhere too. The frontier's casual phrasing echoed forward into later practices, leaving a legacy of harshness that outlasted the posters themselves. When formal law enforcement expanded and courts became more established, the language changed. Warrants replaced posters. Arrest became the stated goal. Killing, while still possible, was no longer openly offered as an equal option. This change was not just legal, but philosophical. It signaled a move away from ambiguity toward accountability. Looking back, the phrase alive or dead feels chilling precisely because of its simplicity. 3 words that transformed human life into a logistical problem. 3 words that allowed death to masquerade as efficiency. 3 words that reveal how easily language can shape action, especially when survival and profit are at stake. In the quiet moments, when lanterns burned low and the wind tugged at fading paper, those words waited. They did not pull a trigger or swing a rope, but they guided hands that did. They whispered permission. They offered an easier path. And again, In a world where certainty was rare and danger constant, that easier path was chosen, leaving behind a trail of final answers where questions might once have lived. History has a strange way of choosing its heroes and villains. In the story of the Wild West, the names that echo across time are usually those of the outlaws, the bank robbers, trained thieves, and gunmen whose lives ended violently and dramatically. Their faces stare back from old photographs, their names are spoken in films and books, and their legends grow larger with each retelling. Yet standing just outside that spotlight are the men who hunted them. The bounty hunters, posses, trackers, and hired guns who spent years chasing these figures across deserts and plains have largely faded into obscurity. The criminals became famous. The hunters became footnotes. Part of this imbalance begins with narrative simplicity. An outlaw's story is easy to frame. There is a clear arc: rebellion, pursuit, and downfall. A single figure stands against the world, defying authority and living by their own rules. This shape fits neatly into myth. The hunter's story, by contrast, is fragmented. He appears briefly, often only at the end, delivering the final moment but not the journey. His role is functional, not romantic. He exists to stop the story, not to be the story. Outlaws also left behind clearer records. Arrests, trials, robberies, and shootouts were written about because they disrupted daily life. Newspapers thrived on sensational crime. A daring robbery sold more papers than a quiet capture in the desert. The criminal's name was repeated, spelled out in headlines, while the hunter's name, if mentioned at all, appeared once and vanished. Repetition is the seed of memory, and outlaws were repeated endlessly. There is also the allure of defiance. Outlaws represented resistance to authority in an era when authority was often distant, corrupt, or ineffective. For struggling settlers, a criminal who embarrassed a railroad company or evaded the law could feel like a symbol of independence, even if that criminal was violent and selfish. Hunters, on the other hand, were associated with enforcement, order, and endings. They reminded people that rules still applied. That reminder was less appealing to celebrate. Many hunters actively avoided attention. Fame was dangerous in their line of work. Being known meant becoming a target for revenge, ambush, or legal trouble. Staying anonymous was a form of self-preservation. Outlaws often sought notoriety, believing it gave them leverage or fear-based protection. Hunters sought the opposite. They let the reward speak for them and disappeared once it was paid. When violence occurred, credit and blame were unevenly distributed. If a hunter killed an outlaw, the focus remained on the outlaw's death, not the hunter's actions. The criminal's life was examined, dramatized, and debated. The hunter's role was reduced to a sentence: he was shot by so and so. Even when the hunter risked everything to bring someone in alive, the result overshadowed the effort. Endings erase processes. Another reason hunters were forgotten is discomfort. Bounty hunting sits uneasily in moral memory. Celebrating criminals is easier than celebrating people who were paid to track and kill other humans. Even when justified, the work was grim. It involved ambush, deception, and lethal force. Later generations preferred cleaner narratives. The outlaw could be reframed as a rebel or tragic figure. The hunter resisted such softening. Popular culture deepened this imbalance. Early Western novels and later films needed clear protagonists. Outlaws offered complexity and drama. Hunters were often portrayed as faceless pursuers or cruel antagonists, reinforcing the idea that they were less worthy of empathy. Over time, these portrayals hardened into assumptions. The public came to expect famous criminals and anonymous lawmen. Documentation also played a role. Many hunters were illiterate or left few personal records. They moved constantly, changed names, and avoided formal ties. Outlaws, especially famous ones, were documented by others obsessively. Letters, wanted posters, court transcripts, and newspaper articles accumulated around them. History favors those surrounded by paper. There is also the matter of endings. Outlaws often died young, violently, and publicly. Such deaths invite storytelling. Hunters rarely received dramatic conclusions. They aged, drifted, or died quietly. Some were killed in unrecorded skirmishes. Others faded into ordinary lives. History struggles to remember people whose stories dissolve instead of explode. Even when hunters were named, their identities blurred. Many shared common names. Some worked briefly and then vanished. Without a single defining act or personality, memory could not anchor them. The outlaw's defiance provided a hook. The hunter's duty did not. Ironically, hunters often shaped history more directly than the criminals they pursued. By ending crime sprees, restoring order, or enforcing warrants, they influenced how towns survived and expanded. Yet their impact was preventative, not spectacular. History tends to celebrate disruption more than stability. There is also a deeper psychological reason. People are drawn to those who break rules more than those who enforce them. Rule breakers introduce chaos, and chaos captures attention. Enforcers restore balance, and balance feels invisible once achieved. When something works, it disappears from focus. When something breaks, it demands explanation. Over time, the outlaw myth softened. Criminals were stripped of victims and consequences, leaving behind charm and rebellion. Hunters, stripped of context, appeared harsh and one-dimensional. Memory simplified both, but only one benefited from the simplification. Yet if history were quieter and more patient, it might remember differently. It might remember the long rides, the false leads, the cold nights, and the constant risk taken by people whose names were never printed in bold. It might remember that every famous outlaw was only famous because someone eventually stopped them. In the end, history remembers what it retells. Outlaws were retold because they fit a story people wanted to hear. Hunters were forgotten because their work closed stories rather than opening them. They arrived at the final page, did what was necessary, and stepped out of view. And so the legends grew around the criminals, while the men who ended those legends were left behind unnamed, riding quietly back into the dust where history rarely looks. On the frontier, morality rarely stood on firm ground. It shifted with distance, danger, and need, blurring lines that elsewhere might have been clear. Bounty hunters lived in this shifting space, operating where law existed more as an idea than a system. Their work unfolded in moral gray zones, where legal boundaries were thin and where crossing them was not always punished. Often it was quietly ignored. The law in many frontier towns was fragile. A sheriff might be elected, but he could be underpaid, underarmed, and overwhelmed. Courts met irregularly. Jails were insecure or non-existent. In this environment, strict adherence to legal procedure felt like a luxury. What mattered was outcome. If someone caused trouble and then vanished, most people were satisfied, regardless of how that result was achieved. Bounty hunters understood this reality instinctively. They were not bound by oaths or oversight. Their authority came from a poster, a promise of payment, and the unspoken approval of communities desperate for order. This freedom allowed them to operate quickly, but it also invited abuse. When they crossed legal lines, the response depended less on the action itself and more on whether it solved a problem. One of the most common violations was trespassing. Hunters entered private property without warrants, searched homes, barns, and camps, and questioned people aggressively. Under formal law, such actions would have been illegal. On the frontier, they were tolerated if the hunter claimed a legitimate purpose. Landowners might protest quietly, but few wanted to appear as though they were protecting a criminal. Arrest procedures were equally flexible. Hunters restrained people without formal charges, relying on resemblance, rumor, or association. Due process was often postponed indefinitely. A man might be bound and transported for days before reaching a town where someone bothered to confirm his identity. If he turned out to be the wrong person, apologies were rare. The law looked away because admitting error would expose the system's fragility. Violence was where the gray zone darkened most. Hunters used force preemptively, justifying it as self-defense. The absence of witnesses made such claims nearly impossible to challenge. If a wanted person was killed, investigators, if they existed at all, often accepted the hunter's account. The alternative was uncomfortable, acknowledging that the town had indirectly encouraged an execution. Bribery and intimidation were also common tools. Hunters paid informants, threatened associates, and leveraged fear to extract information. These tactics violated the spirit of the law, but they produced results. Authorities who benefited from those results rarely asked how they were obtained. Silence became a form of complicity. The law's selective blindness was not accidental. Towns relied on bounty hunters precisely because they could do what officials could not openly do. Hunters acted as a pressure release, absorbing the moral cost of violence and coercion so communities could maintain the appearance of order. When things went too far, hunters were labeled as rogues rather than representatives of the system that enabled them. This dynamic created a double standard. Ordinary citizens were expected to follow rules, while hunters operated beyond them. The distinction rested on usefulness. As long as a hunter delivered outcomes that aligned with community interests, legal transgressions were forgiven. When those outcomes threatened the town itself, tolerance evaporated quickly. Some hunters exploited this arrangement deliberately. They pushed boundaries knowing that consequences were unlikely. Others drifted across lines gradually, shaped by repeated exposure to danger and moral compromise. In a world where survival depended on decisiveness, restraint felt risky. Each ignored violation made the next easier. Authorities also benefited personally from this ambiguity. Sheriffs could claim success without bearing responsibility. Judges avoided difficult cases. Politicians pointed to restored order. Everyone gained something by not looking too closely. The gray zone became a shared space of convenience. Occasionally, the law did intervene. When a hunter harmed the wrong person, disrupted commerce, or embarrassed powerful interests, accountability appeared suddenly. Trials were held. Punishments were imposed. These moments revealed that the law had always been present. It had simply chosen when to act. Selective enforcement exposed the hypocrisy beneath frontier justice. For the hunted, this ambiguity was terrifying. They could not rely on legal protections because those protections were inconsistently applied. Surrender offered no guarantee of safety. Appeals to law might fall on ears already decided. The gray zone swallowed certainty, leaving fear in its place. Even townspeople felt the unease. They knew, often without saying so, that order had been restored through questionable means. The silence that followed was heavy. Celebrations were muted. Stories were told without details. Forgetting became a coping mechanism. As formal institutions strengthened, these gray zones narrowed. Procedures hardened. Oversight increased. But the legacy remained. Stories of frontier justice carried a tone of ambiguity, neither fully condemning nor fully celebrating the methods used. The myth endured, softened by distance. Looking back, the moral gray zones of bounty hunting reveal a broader truth about societies under strain. When systems are weak, ethics bend to necessity, the law becomes flexible, and those who operate in its shadows gain power. The danger lies not only in the actions taken, but in the silence that follows them. In the end, the law's willingness to look away was as significant as the hunter's willingness to cross lines. Together, they formed an unspoken agreement. Results mattered more than rules. That agreement kept towns alive in the short term, but it left a complicated legacy, one where justice and convenience intertwined so tightly that separating them became almost impossible, even long after the dust had settled. On the frontier, certainty was a luxury few could afford. Names traveled slowly, descriptions were vague, and faces blurred together across dust, distance, and exhaustion. In this environment, false accusations and mistaken identities were not rare accidents. They were an expected consequence of a system built on speed, fear, and profit. Innocent people were captured, injured, and sometimes killed simply because they resembled a wanted man, because someone thought they did, or because doubt was inconvenient. Bounty posters were the starting point of many tragedies. They offered rough sketches of identity, height estimated by memory, hair color guessed under poor light, scars exaggerated or invented, age ranges stretched across decades. Names were often common misspelled, or shared by dozens of men across territories. These descriptions were treated as sufficient, not because they were accurate, but because they were all that existed. Hunters relied on these fragments to make rapid decisions. Pausing to verify details meant risking escape or losing the trail entirely. In a system that rewarded results, hesitation felt dangerous. When a man roughly fit a description, resemblance became proof enough. The cost of being wrong was rarely higher than the cost of letting a bounty slip away. Towns contributed to this danger through rumor. Someone would swear they recognized a face from a poster, even if they had only glanced at it once. Another would confirm the suspicion, eager to be helpful or simply involved. Certainty grew through repetition, not evidence. By the time a hunter acted, doubt had already been crowded out by confidence manufactured in conversation. For innocent people, these moments arrived suddenly. A knock at the door, a weapon raised in the street, a rope thrown without warning. Protests were often ignored or interpreted as guilt. Fear sounded like deception. Confusion looked like resistance. The more someone insisted they were not the right person, the more suspicious they appeared. Mistaken identity was especially common among travelers and laborers. Men moved constantly for work, carrying few documents and leaving little trace. Without fixed residences or strong community ties, they were vulnerable. No one knew them well enough to defend them convincingly. Their anonymity made them interchangeable. Language barriers worsened the problem. Immigrants who spoke little English struggled to explain themselves. Their inability to respond quickly or clearly was seen as evasion. Accents became suspect. Silence became dangerous. In these moments, identity was not something you possessed. It was something others decided for you. Physical resemblance did not need to be strong. A similar beard, a limp, a hat worn low. In a world where most men dressed alike and weather-altered appearances constantly, these details were fragile anchors for judgment. Yet they were treated as decisive. Once captured, innocence did not guarantee safety. Transport was rough and violent. Bound men were dragged behind horses, struck for slowing down, denied water for questioning. Injuries accumulated regardless of guilt. By the time someone reached a town where verification might occur, the damage was already done. Sometimes verification never came. If a hunter believed they had the right man, confirmation bias took over. Any discrepancy was explained away. The system did not encourage second thoughts. Payment depended on confidence, not caution. If doubts lingered, killing resolved them permanently. Communities often learned of mistakes only afterward, if at all. A body arrived. A name was announced. Someone spoke up too late, realizing the dead man had been a neighbor, a worker, a relative. Silence followed. Apologies were rare. Responsibility was diffuse. The hunter blamed the poster. The town blamed the hunter. The law blamed circumstance. False accusations also arose from personal vendettas. Accusing someone of being wanted was an easy way to remove a rival, debtor, or enemy. Hunters rarely questioned motives behind tips. Information that pointed toward a reward was welcomed. Lies thrived in this environment, rewarded with consequences far beyond what the liar intended or admitted. The innocent learned quickly that resemblance was dangerous. Some altered their appearance constantly, shaving beards, changing hairstyles, avoiding familiar clothing. Others avoided towns entirely, choosing isolation over risk. Fear reshaped daily behavior, narrowing lives. Mistaken identity fed a deeper mistrust of the law. People saw that innocence offered little protection. Survival depended on visibility, alliances, and luck. This awareness hardened communities, making them less cooperative and more secretive. Helping strangers felt risky. Trust eroded. Even when mistakes were acknowledged, remedies were limited. Compensation was rare. Legal recourse was slow or non-existent. Families grieved without closure. Records, if kept, were thin. Over time, these stories faded. overshadowed by the more dramatic legends of actual outlaws. History remembered the criminals because their stories were simple and dramatic. It forgot the innocent because their stories were messy, unresolved, and uncomfortable. They did not fit the myth of frontier justice. They exposed its cost. Looking back, false accusations and mistaken identities reveal how fragile identity becomes in systems that value speed over certainty. When authority is diffuse and incentives reward decisiveness, resemblance can become a death sentence. The frontier's violence was not only directed at the guilty. It spilled outward, touching anyone who happened to look like trouble in a world that could not afford to look twice. In the quiet that followed these mistakes, towns moved on, posters were replaced, names changed, new rewards were offered. The system continued uncorrected, and somewhere along the road, another innocent face passed under a shadow, unaware that in this world, being similar was sometimes enough to be condemned. On the frontier, promises were often written in ink but honored in dust. A bounty poster looked official, nailed straight and square to a wall, stamped with authority and confidence. It spoke in firm numbers and clear intent. Yet behind those neat lines lived a reality far less stable. Payment disputes and betrayals were common. And for many bounty hunters, the greatest danger was not the outlaw they chased, but the town that promised to pay them. Money on the frontier was uncertain to begin with. Towns were young, banks unreliable, and funds often tied up in land, livestock, or speculation. A reward might be offered in good faith, calculated in a moment of fear or anger, without anyone stopping to ask whether the money actually existed. When the crisis passed and the hunter returned, bruised and exhausted, reality intruded. The purse was lighter than expected. The enthusiasm had cooled. Some towns stalled deliberately. A hunter would arrive with proof and be told the sheriff was away, the judge unavailable, the treasurer sick. Days passed. Nights lengthened. Each delay tested patience and resources. The longer a hunter waited, the more desperate they became, until accepting less than promised felt better than leaving with nothing. Other refusals were blunt. The town simply denied responsibility. The poster, they claimed, was outdated. The reward had expired. Circumstances had changed. Sometimes they argued that the hunter had misunderstood the terms, that the bounty required the prisoner alive, not dead, or proof different from what was delivered. Language was twisted, not because it was convincing, but because it bought time and leverage. Sheriffs were central figures in these betrayals. They were the face of the law, but also deeply embedded in local politics and pressures. A sheriff might have posted a bounty to calm a fearful town, never expecting anyone to actually collect it. When someone did, the sheriff stood between obligation and convenience. Paying the hunter might empty the town's funds or anger influential citizens. Letting the hunter leave unpaid shifted the cost elsewhere. Vanishing sheriffs became a grim joke. A hunter would arrive to find the office locked, the desk empty, and rumors circulating that the sheriff had ridden out unexpectedly. Maybe he had. Maybe he was avoiding a confrontation. In either case, absence functioned as denial. Without a clear authority to argue with, the hunter was left shouting into a void. Contracts, when they existed at all, offered little protection. Written agreements were rare and loosely worded. Many bounties were verbal, spoken in urgency and forgotten just as quickly. Even written contracts depended on enforcement, and enforcement required institutions the frontier lacked. A piece of paper could not compel payment if the town decided otherwise. Some hunters tried to collect by force. They threatened sheriffs, seized property, or intimidated officials. Occasionally this worked. More often it backfired. The hunter was suddenly recast as the problem. The town closed ranks. Violence escalated. A man who arrived as an agent of order could leave branded an outlaw himself. Betrayal cut deeper when it came from personal relationships. Hunters sometimes worked closely with local lawmen, sharing information and risk. These partnerships created trust, or at least the illusion of it. When payment was withheld despite that shared effort, Resentment lingered. The sense of being used, of having absorbed danger so others could remain clean-handed, hardened many hunters permanently. There were also cases where towns claimed poverty selectively. Money appeared quickly for other needs, repairs, celebrations, new projects, while rewards remained unpaid. Hunters noticed. They learned that payment was not about ability but willingness. This realization eroded any remaining belief in fairness. The uncertainty of payment shaped behavior in dangerous ways. Knowing that promises might be broken, hunters sought compensation elsewhere. They confiscated belongings from the hunted. They demanded expenses upfront. They cut corners, choosing faster, deadlier methods to minimize costs. Betrayal upstream produced brutality downstream. For some, the system taught a simple lesson: trust no one. Hunters became solitary, secretive, and suspicious. They avoided relying on towns altogether, preferring private clients or informal arrangements that could be enforced through reputation or threat. The official bounty system lost credibility, replaced by personal deals that were no less unstable. Payment disputes also revealed how disposable hunters were. Once the job was done, their usefulness ended. Towns that had welcomed them days earlier now saw them as liabilities. Paying them invited future claims. Refusing them encouraged them to leave quietly. Forgetting them entirely was often the easiest option. Families of hunters bore the hidden cost of these betrayals. A man might leave expecting to return with money, only to come home empty-handed or not at all. Wives and children waited on promises that never materialized. The risk was private, the reward uncertain. This imbalance made bounty hunting a cycle of desperation rather than opportunity. Occasionally, disputes escalated into public scandals. Hunters sued towns, confronted officials, or aired grievances loudly. These cases exposed the system's flaws but rarely fixed them. More often, they ended with compromise payments or quiet exile. The lesson reinforced was not justice, but pragmatism. Make trouble only if you can survive it. Over time, stories of betrayal spread among hunters. Certain towns earned reputations for dishonesty. Certain sheriffs were known to dodge obligations. These reputations shaped routes and decisions, adding another layer of calculation to an already dangerous profession. Yet even with warnings, desperation drove people to take chances again and again. The law's role in these disputes was telling. Courts, when they existed, were slow and inconsistent. Judges were reluctant to side with hunters whose methods were questionable, even if the claim was legitimate. Legality blurred with morality, and morality was judged unevenly. Hunters found themselves arguing for fairness in systems that had never promised it. As formal governance expanded, these disputes became less common, but never vanished entirely. The memory of broken promises lingered, shaping attitudes toward authority long after the frontier era ended. Distrust did not fade easily; it had been earned too often. Looking back, payment disputes and betrayals exposed the transactional heart of frontier justice. Bounties were marketed as contracts, but treated as suggestions. Hunters took on risk that towns could disown. The system functioned not because it was fair, but because people were desperate enough to accept unfair terms. In the quiet aftermath of a refused payment, a hunter faced a bitter truth. The outlaw had been easier to track than the obligation to pay. The chase, dangerous as it was, followed clearer rules than the aftermath. Guns, terrain, and fear were predictable. Promises were not. And so many hunters rode away from towns not richer, but poorer in trust. The posters remained on the walls, bright and confident, offering certainty they could not deliver. Somewhere down the road, another hunter would read them, believe them, and begin the cycle again. Unaware that the most fragile part of the hunt was never the capture, but the promise waiting at the end. Violence did not arrive suddenly for most bounty hunters. It crept in slowly, disguised as necessity, wrapped in routine, normalized through repetition. The first gunfight was unforgettable, the sharp crack of sound. The wait time seemed to narrow, the disbelief afterward that the body on the ground had been alive moments before. But the frontier did not allow lingering. There was always another trail, another poster, another name with a price attached. And with each encounter, violence became less an event and more a condition of daily life. Gunfights were rarely dramatic duels staged at noon. They erupted unexpectedly in alleys, doorways, campsites, and open plains. A hunter learned quickly that hesitation could be fatal. Reflex replaced reflection. The mind adapted by narrowing focus, pushing emotion aside to make room for survival. What once caused shaking hands gradually produced steadier aim. Fear did not disappear, it learned to stay quiet. Ambushes further reshaped perception. Hunters learned that danger often arrived without warning. A rustle in the brush, a shadow where none should be, a sound that did not belong. The nervous system stayed alert even in moments meant for rest. Sleep became light and fragmented. Dreams replayed fragments of violence, training the mind to remain watchful even in darkness. Executions, whether sanctioned, implied, or improvised, left deeper marks. Killing someone who resisted in a fight felt different from killing someone who was already cornered. Yet the system blurred that distinction. Posters did not require explanation, only results. Over time, hunters learned to rationalize finality. Ending a life became framed as closing a task. Resolving a problem, language shifted. People were no longer killed, they were put down, taken care of, handled. This linguistic shift mattered. It softened the psychological impact, allowing the mind to distance itself from the act. Violence became procedural. You did what was required, then moved on. Dwelling on it was dangerous not morally, but practically. Reflection slowed reaction. Reaction kept you alive. Repeated exposure changed emotional responses. Empathy dulled, not because hunters were cruel by nature, but because empathy became a liability. Feeling too much in a violent environment created hesitation, doubt, and distraction. Those who could not adapt often quit early, or did not survive long enough to quit. Those who remained learned to compartmentalize, sealing away feelings until they could no longer be accessed easily. The body learned violence too. Muscles responded faster. Hands moved without conscious thought. The sound of gunfire stopped triggering panic and began triggering readiness. This conditioning was efficient, but it carried a cost. Outside of combat, the same reflexes caused problems. Sudden movements sparked aggression, loud noises triggered tension. Calm felt unfamiliar, even suspicious. Isolation intensified these effects. Many hunters worked alone or in small temporary groups. There were few opportunities to talk openly about what they experienced. Silence became the default response to trauma. Without language to process events, memories settled into the body instead, emerging as irritability, restlessness, or numbness. Executions performed without ceremony weighed heavily, even when justified. Watching life leave someone's eyes is an intimate act, one that leaves traces regardless of belief or intent. Some hunters drank to quiet those traces. Others hardened, convincing themselves that feeling nothing was proof of strength. Neither approach erased the impact, it merely delayed it. Over time, violence began to feel inevitable. Hunters came to expect it, to plan for it, to assume it would occur. This expectation shaped decisions. Encounters were approached with force already in mind. Negotiation felt risky. Mercy felt uncertain. When violence is routine, escalation becomes the default. This mindset affected relationships with others. Trust eroded. Strangers were potential threats. Even allies were watched carefully. Humor grew darker. Conversations shortened. The world narrowed into zones of safety and danger, with little space in between. Some hunters noticed changes and tried to resist them. They set personal rules. They avoided unnecessary confrontation. They sought to bring targets in alive when possible. These efforts required constant vigilance against the tide of normalization. Each exception reaffirmed the rule that violence was always waiting, just beneath the surface. Communities reinforced this conditioning. Hunters who acted decisively noted approval. Hesitation was criticized. Results mattered more than restraint. Praise and payment followed outcomes, not methods. This external reinforcement aligned with internal adaptation, strengthening the cycle. Violence also reshaped identity. Being capable of lethal force became a defining trait. It brought respect and fear. Losing that edge felt dangerous, even shameful. Hunters measured themselves by reputation, by stories told about their actions. In this way, violence became not just routine, but central to self-concept. The long-term effects were rarely discussed. There were no words like trauma or stress to frame them. Symptoms were interpreted as character flaws or personal failures. Restlessness meant weakness. Nightmares meant guilt. Withdrawal meant coldness. Without understanding, hunters often blamed themselves rather than the environment that shaped them. As years passed, some found it difficult to re-enter ordinary life. Calm towns felt unreal. Conversation seemed shallow. Work without danger felt meaningless. The mind trained for constant threat struggled to downshift. Violence had carved deep grooves, and stepping out of them required effort many could not sustain. Others carried their conditioning quietly. They married, settled, and tried to forget. But certain sounds, smells, or moments pulled them back instantly. The frontier lived on inside them long after they left it behind. Looking back, the routine nature of violence among bounty hunters reveals how environments shape minds. Constant exposure does not merely desensitize, it restructures perception, emotion, and identity. What begins as survival becomes habit. What becomes habit becomes normal. In the end, the greatest transformation was subtle. Violence did not turn most hunters into monsters. It turned them into specialists, people adapted to a narrow, brutal set of circumstances. When those circumstances ended, the adaptation remained, often without a place to go. The frontier eventually changed. Institutions strengthened. Postures disappeared. Gunfights became rarer. But for those who lived through violence as routine, the change came too late. The mind does not unlearn easily what it learned to survive. And so long after the dust settled and the roads grew quiet, echoes of that routine continued, carried silently by those who had lived too long where violence was just another part of the day. The image is familiar and seductive, a lone rider silhouetted against the horizon, moving with purpose through open land, unburdened and fearless. Popular memory paints the bounty hunter this way, a solitary figure of confidence and resolve, riding not in loneliness but in freedom. Yet the reality was far less romantic. Most bounty hunters did ride alone, but not in glory. They rode in isolation, shaped by paranoia and sustained by a constant, low-level fear that never fully released its grip. Working alone was rarely a choice rooted in pride. It was often the result of necessity. Partnerships were risky. Splitting a reward cut already uncertain pay in half. Trust was fragile in a profession where betrayal could be fatal. A partner might turn on you for money, disappear at the worst moment, or make a mistake that drew fire. For many hunters, solitude felt safer than reliance. Isolation became a form of armor. Riding alone meant controlling every decision, every movement, every risk. There was no need to debate strategy or compromise on timing. This control brought a sense of security, but it also amplified vulnerability. With no one watching your back, every sound carried weight. Every shadow mattered. Silence grew heavy. Paranoia was not irrational in this context, it was adaptive. Hunters knew they were targets. Outlaws had allies, family, and friends who might seek revenge. Informants could lie, towns could turn hostile. Even other hunters might compete for the same reward. Suspicion became a survival skill, honed through experience and reinforced by close calls. Travel itself deepened isolation. Long stretches of land separated towns by days or weeks. Conversations were brief and guarded. Names were withheld. Stories were edited. A hunter learned to reveal little and observe much. Emotional distance mirrored physical distance, reinforcing the sense of being cut off from ordinary life. The myth of glory assumes recognition, but recognition was dangerous. Being known meant being tracked. Many hunters avoided fame deliberately, changing routes and identities. They passed through towns quickly, leaving before curiosity turned into attention. Glory belonged to outlaws because notoriety served them. Hunters needed anonymity to survive. Fear underpinned this entire existence. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger alone, but the dull, constant fear of what might come next. It lingered during meals, during sleep, during moments meant for rest. Fear shaped routines: where to camp, when to move, how long to stay. It rarely spoke loudly, but it was always present. Isolation magnified internal struggles. Without companions to share experiences, thoughts circled endlessly. Memories replayed, doubts grew. Decisions weighed heavier, because there was no one else to confirm or challenge them. The lone rider carried not only gear and weapons, but an unspoken psychological load. Even when hunters joined posses or temporary groups, the loneliness persisted. These alliances were transactional, short-lived, and cautious. Trust was provisional. Everyone watched everyone else. Once the job ended, the group dissolved, and each rider returned to solitude, carrying experiences no one else fully shared. The contrast between myth and reality widened over time. Stories told later stripped away fear and doubt, replacing them with confidence and purpose. The lone rider became a symbol of independence rather than isolation. But those who lived it knew the difference. Riding alone meant facing decisions with no buffer, no shared responsibility. Paranoia affected how hunters saw others. Kindness was suspect. Help was scrutinized. Offers of food or shelter were weighed for hidden motives. This constant evaluation strained human connection. Over time, relationships outside the hunt felt risky or unnecessary. The world narrowed to manageable distances and familiar threats. Sleep was rarely restful. Alone at night, every sound could signal danger. Hunters slept lightly, weapons close, waking frequently. Fatigue compounded stress, making days longer and decisions harder. The body adapted, but the cost accumulated quietly. Some hunters believed solitude made them stronger. They prided themselves on self-reliance, seeing dependence as weakness. This belief helped justify isolation, turning necessity into identity. But identity built on solitude often came with rigidity, leaving little room for vulnerability or change. Communities contributed to the myth by projecting expectations onto hunters. They wanted saviors, not frightened men. Hunters learned to perform confidence, masking uncertainty. This performance reinforced the myth, even as it deepened internal dissonance. The mask protected them socially but isolated them emotionally. Fear also shaped exit paths. Many hunters did not know how to stop. Leaving the road meant re-entering a world that expected stability, trust, and openness. After years of isolation and vigilance, those qualities felt foreign. Riding alone was familiar. Settling down was not. In the end, the lone rider myth says more about what later generations wanted to believe than about what actually was. It transforms isolation into freedom and fear into courage, smoothing rough edges into legend. The truth is quieter and heavier. Most bounty hunters rode without applause, without certainty, and without companionship. They rode because they had to, because it felt safer than standing still, because isolation was easier than trust. Their journeys were marked not by glory, but by long silences, restless nights, and the constant calculation of risk. When the dust finally settled and the roads grew quiet, many carried the loneliness with them. The myth stayed behind, polished and retold. But the men themselves knew what it had cost to ride alone, and why the open horizon often felt less like freedom and more like the only place left to go. On the frontier, identity was never fixed. A man could be hunted one year and hunting the next, not because of redemption or justice, but because circumstances shifted and survival demanded adaptation. Outlaws who became bounty hunters were not rare exceptions. They were a predictable outcome of a system built on loose rules, desperation, and opportunity. Criminals turned hunters for profit, protection, or revenge, slipping across moral boundaries that were already thin and frayed. For many outlaws, becoming a hunter was a practical calculation. Life on the run was exhausting. Constant movement, suspicion, and fear wore people down. Turning hunter offered a way out, not a clean slate, but a quieter existence. By chasing others, an outlaw could redirect attention away from himself. The system rarely asked where a hunter came from, only whether he delivered results. Past crimes faded quickly when present usefulness was clear. Profit was the most obvious motivation. An outlaw already knew how to track, ambush, and survive violence. These skills transferred easily. Hunting people for money felt familiar, even efficient. The same instincts used to evade capture could now be used to predict how others would run. In this way, former criminals often became effective hunters, precisely because they understood the mindset of those being hunted. Protection was another powerful incentive. Working as a hunter created informal immunity. Lawmen who might otherwise pursue an outlaw were willing to look away if he was bringing in more dangerous targets. Favor replaced innocence. A man's past mattered less than his current usefulness. This unspoken bargain offered safety without requiring confession or punishment. Revenge also played a role. Some outlaws had been betrayed by partners, rivals, or gangs. Becoming a hunter offered legal cover for settling scores. A former associate with a price on his head became a legitimate target. Personal vendettas could be reframed as law enforcement, blurring justice and retribution until they were indistinguishable. Communities often welcomed these transformed figures cautiously but willingly. A man with a reputation for violence inspired fear, but fear could be useful. Towns desperate for order valued effectiveness over morality. If a former outlaw could remove threats, his past became irrelevant. Redemption was not required, results were. This fluidity of roles revealed how shallow the distinction between outlaw and hunter truly was. Both operated outside strict legal frameworks. Both relied on violence and intimidation. The difference lay in who paid them and who tolerated them. Switching sides did not require moral change, only a shift in alignment. Former outlaws also brought a darker edge to bounty hunting. They were less constrained by hesitation or doubt. Having already crossed legal and moral lines, crossing them again felt familiar. This made them both effective and dangerous. Where others might hesitate, they acted. Where others sought arrest, they delivered death. Lawmen were often complicit in this arrangement. Sheriffs who lacked manpower quietly relied on former criminals to do work they could not openly sanction. This outsourcing of violence allowed authorities to maintain appearances while benefiting from ruthless efficiency. If things went wrong, the hunter's criminal past provided a convenient scapegoat. Trust, however, was always conditional. Former outlaws were watched closely, even as they were used. Their loyalty was assumed only as long as profit or protection held. The relationship was transactional, fragile, and temporary, yet for many it was enough. Psychologically, the transition from outlaw to hunter required little adjustment. The skills, habits, and worldview remained intact. What changed was justification. Actions once taken for personal gain were now framed as service. This reframing eased guilt and offered legitimacy without requiring accountability. Some former outlaws believed they were correcting past mistakes. Hunting criminals like themselves felt like balance, even penance. Others felt nothing of the sort. They saw the role as another hustle, another way to survive in a world that offered few stable paths. The hunted often recognized these hunters instantly. A former outlaw carried himself differently. He anticipated movements, predicted lies, and understood desperation. Encounters between such figures were charged with mutual recognition, a silent understanding that they were reflections of each other, separated only by circumstance. Over time, some of these hunters drifted back toward crime. When payments failed, protection vanished, or opportunities shifted, allegiance changed again. The frontier did not enforce loyalty. It rewarded adaptability. Switching sides was not betrayal, it was strategy. The existence of outlaw turned hunters exposed a deeper truth about frontier justice. It was not built on morality, but on functionality. The system did not transform people, it repurposed them. Violence was not eliminated, it was redirected. History often glosses over these figures because they complicate simple narratives. They are neither heroes nor villains. They undermine the idea of justice as a moral force, revealing it instead as a flexible arrangement shaped by need. In the end, outlaws who became hunters did not escape their pasts, they carried them forward in a different form. The same hands that once took now delivered. The same instincts that once fled now pursued. The line between criminal and enforcer blurred until it vanished entirely. On the frontier, survival mattered more than consistency. Identity followed opportunity, and in a world where law was negotiable and violence routine, becoming a hunter was often just another way for an outlaw to keep moving forward, one step ahead of consequence, under a different name. The frontier is often remembered as a world shaped almost entirely by men, a place of guns, horses, and lawlessness where masculinity defined survival. In this version of history, bounty hunting appears as one of the most aggressively male roles imaginable. Yet beneath that familiar surface lived a quieter, largely forgotten truth. Women did participate in bounty hunting, tracking fugitives and delivering results in a society that rarely acknowledged their presence. Their stories were not absent because they did nothing, but because they did too much outside what history expected to see. Women on the frontier were already experts at invisibility. They moved through towns, camps, and households without drawing suspicion. In a male-dominated world where danger was assumed to wear a man's face, women were often overlooked. This blindness became an advantage. While men were watched, questioned, and challenged, women listened, observed, and gathered information. Tracking did not always begin on horseback with a rifle. Often it began in kitchens, boarding houses, laundries, and saloons where women worked, places where fugitives relaxed their guard. Some women hunted out of necessity. Widowed, abandonment, or economic collapse left few options. The frontier did not offer safety nets. If a woman could ride, shoot, track, or gather intelligence, those skills could be turned into survival. Bounty hunting was dangerous, but so was poverty. Choosing risk was sometimes the only way forward. Others were drawn in through proximity. Wives, sisters, or partners of hunters learned the work slowly, absorbing knowledge without formal training. They memorized routes, patterns, and behaviors. When men were injured, killed, or simply disappeared, women sometimes continued the work themselves. Not as replacements, but as extensions of roles they already understood intimately. Women trackers often relied less on force and more on patience. They followed social trails rather than physical ones. A change in conversation, a sudden silence, a name avoided. These were clues as meaningful as footprints. In communities where everyone knew everyone, social knowledge was power, and women were often the keepers of it. Disguise played a role as well. Women could shift identities fluidly: worker, traveler, wife, widow, without raising alarm. This flexibility allowed them to cross boundaries men could not. They could enter spaces closed to male hunters, overhear conversations meant to be private, and move closer to targets without provoking fear. Their presence felt ordinary, and ordinariness was cover. Violence was not absent from their work, but it was often a last resort. Women hunters understood that physical confrontation carried higher risk in a society that doubted their legitimacy. Many focused on capture through strategy rather than direct force. They orchestrated situations where fugitives were cornered, surprised, or delivered into custody by others. The result mattered more than the method. When women did use violence, it was often described later as shocking or unnatural, as though necessity had no gender. These reactions reveal more about cultural expectations than about the reality of frontier life. Survival erased many distinctions. Hunger, danger, and fear were equalizers. Recognition was rare. Payment disputes affected women hunters even more severely than men. Towns that already hesitated to pay bounties found additional excuses when the collector was female. Doubts were raised. Claims were questioned. Authority was challenged. Women learned quickly that proof needed to be undeniable, sometimes grimly so, to overcome disbelief. Lawmen's reactions ranged from reluctant acceptance to outright hostility. Some welcomed results regardless of source. Others felt threatened, their authority undermined by someone who did not fit the image of enforcement. This tension kept many women operating quietly, avoiding official acknowledgement even when they were effective. The emotional toll was heavy. Women hunters navigated constant contradiction. They were expected to embody gentleness and restraint while operating in a profession defined by danger and death. There were few peers to confide in, few models to follow. Isolation was compounded by secrecy. Many lived double lives, known publicly as workers or caregivers while privately tracking dangerous individuals. History's silence about these women is not accidental. Their existence disrupts simple narratives. They complicate the myth of the West as a purely masculine proving ground. They reveal that competence, not gender, determined survival. Rather than celebrate this complexity, later storytellers erased it. Some women hunters left faint traces, mentions in court records, newspaper oddities, rumors passed down through families. Others vanished entirely, their work absorbed into collective outcomes without attribution. When a fugitive was captured quietly without spectacle, there was little incentive to record who made it happen. Their motivations were as varied as those of men. Some sought independence in a world that constrained them. Others pursued justice as they understood it. Still others acted out of revenge or necessity. The frontier did not offer moral clarity. It offered opportunity and consequence. What united these women was adaptability. They navigated male-dominated spaces by understanding them, not confronting them directly. They used assumptions against those who held them. Underestimation became a tool. In reflecting on women and bounty hunting, it becomes clear that the frontier's history is incomplete without them. Their stories remind us that power often operates quietly, through access rather than force, patience rather than spectacle. The absence of their names does not indicate absence of action. They rode different paths, often alone, often unseen. They tracked not just across land, but across social landscapes shaped by expectation and denial. And when the work was done, they returned to invisibility, carrying knowledge and experiences that history chose not to record. In the end, the lesser-known role of women in bounty hunting challenges the idea that the past was simple or uniform. It reveals a frontier shaped not only by guns and bravado, but by observation, resilience, and quiet resolve. These women did not ride into legend. They moved through the margins, where survival mattered more than recognition, and where history, even now, rarely thinks to look. The end of the bounty era did not arrive with a gunshot or a final dramatic ride into the sunset. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, unfolding over decades as paperwork replaced posters and institutions replaced individuals. Bounty hunters did not vanish overnight. They were slowly edged out, made unnecessary not by condemnation but by structure. The world that had once relied on them changed, and in that change, their role dissolved. At first the signs were subtle. Towns grew into cities. Dirt streets became paved. Telegraph lines connected distant places, shrinking the gaps that fugitives once disappeared into. Information moved faster than horses ever could. A name no longer had to be nailed to a wall and hoped for. It could be transmitted, copied, verified. The mystery that bounty hunters thrived on began to fade. Law enforcement professionalized gradually. Sheriffs gained deputies. Deputies gained training. Uniforms, procedures, and chains of command replaced improvisation. Arrests became matters of process rather than pursuit. The authority to detain someone became formalized, no longer something a piece of paper and a weapon could grant. Courts grew stronger too. Trials became more regular. Warrants replaced vague descriptions. Evidence mattered more than reputation. The space where bounty hunters once operated, the wide gap between crime and consequence narrowed. As that gap closed, so did tolerance for ambiguity. The language changed as well. Wanted posters gave way to warrants and bulletins. Alive or dead disappeared from official phrasing. Death was no longer an acceptable outcome written casually into law. The shift was not just legal, it was moral. Society began to insist that outcomes follow rules, not convenience. Economic changes played a role. Stable wages in factories, railroads, and cities offered alternatives to dangerous, uncertain work. Fewer people were desperate enough to gamble their lives on reward money that might never be paid. Risk lost its appeal when predictability became available. Technology further eroded the bounty hunter's advantage. Fingerprinting, photographs, and record-keeping made mistaken identity harder to excuse. Coordination between jurisdictions reduced the need for independent trackers. The lone hunter became redundant in a world increasingly defined by systems. Importantly, there was no formal decree banning bounty hunters from history. They were not outlawed in a dramatic sense. They were simply absorbed, sidelined, or ignored. Some transitioned into formal law enforcement. Others faded into obscurity, carrying skills that no longer had a clear place. This quiet ending allowed society to distance itself from the moral compromises of the past. There was no reckoning, no collective admission of how much violence had been outsourced. Instead, progress was framed as natural evolution. The bounty era was treated as a primitive phase, something grown out of rather than confronted. Yet the legacy lingered. Cultural memory held onto the imagery even as reality moved on. Stories, novels, and films resurrected the bounty hunter as a symbol of rugged independence. The myth survived because it was simpler than the truth. It celebrated decisiveness without examining cost. Modern law enforcement inherited some habits shaped in that earlier era. The emphasis on results, the tolerance for force, the quiet approval of outcomes over methods, these did not vanish completely. They were reshaped, regulated, and debated, but traces remained. The language of pursuit still echoes. Manhunts, most wanted, and reward systems continue in softened forms. The idea that danger can be resolved by identifying and removing individuals persists, even when the methods differ. Public fascination also keeps the legacy alive. There is something compelling about individuals standing outside systems, acting decisively where institutions hesitate. This fascination reflects ongoing tension between order and autonomy, between rules and results. For those who lived through the transition, the end felt anticlimactic. Skills once essential became liabilities. Stories once respected became uncomfortable. Many carried their experiences quietly, watching a world emerge that no longer needed them. The quiet end of the bounty era reminds us that not all historical shifts are loud. Some happen through redundancy rather than resistance. Power structures change by making old roles unnecessary rather than illegal. Yet the moral questions raised by bounty hunting never fully disappeared. Who enforces the law? At what cost? How much force is acceptable in the name of safety? These questions still surface, reshaped but familiar. The bounty hunter's legacy lingers not because the profession survives, but because the tensions that created it remain. Whenever systems strain, the temptation to bypass them returns. Whenever fear rises faster than institutions can respond, the old logic whispers again. In the end, the bounty era faded because society chose structure over improvisation, but it never fully let go of the stories. The posters came down. The roads changed. The lone riders disappeared into memory. What remained was a cautionary echo, a reminder of what happens when justice is left to individuals, and of how quietly even the most violent chapters can end without ever being fully closed. As the night settles and the dust of the frontier finally drifts back to the earth, the world of bounty hunters fades into quiet reflection. They were never the clean heroes of legend, nor were they simply villains riding under the cover of law. They existed in the spaces in between, where fear outpaced order, where survival mattered more than morality, and where justice was often improvised rather than decided. Bounty hunters thrived in a time when systems were fragile and people were desperate. Their lives were shaped by uncertainty, violence, and isolation, not by glory. For every famous outlaw remembered by history, there were countless hunters whose names vanished, carrying the weight of choices no one else wanted to make. They crossed lines because the lines were never clearly drawn. They endured betrayal because promises were easier to make than to keep. And they adapted, sometimes brutally, because adaptation was the only path forward. When modern law enforcement slowly replaced them, it did not erase their influence. It absorbed their lessons, their mistakes, and their contradictions. The legacy of the bounty era lingers in the way society still wrestles with justice, force, and accountability. It reminds us that when institutions fail, individuals step in, and that the cost of that step is often paid quietly, long after the danger has passed. Tonight, as we let these stories rest, we can see the Wild West not as a place of simple legends, but as a human landscape shaped by fear, resilience, and imperfect choices. The riders are gone. The posters have faded, but the questions they leave behind remain, whispering softly beneath the calm, inviting us not to judge too quickly, and perhaps to finally let the past sleep